Hi, I'm James Naylor Green, professor of Brazilian history and culture at Brown University and the national co-coordinator of the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil. And this is Brazil Unfiltered. Today, I have the enormous honor of interviewing Mauricio Moura, who is the founder and chief executive officer of IDEA Big Data, formerly IDEA Inteligência, which seeks to transform and integrate data, facts, analysis, and experiences into intelligence, all in real time. He is also a visiting scholar at the George Washington University and a former investment officer of the International Finance Corporation. He holds a bachelor's degree in economics from the University of São Paulo, a master's degree in social sciences from the University of Chicago, another master's degree in political management from George Washington University, and a PhD in public sector economics from the Fundação Getúlio Vargas. Welcome, Mauricio. It's really a pleasure to have you on Brazil Unfiltered.
James, thanks so much for the invitation. The pleasure is all mine.
So we're going to talk about a lot of things today, but first I'd like to have your overall assessment of where the presidential race is in general terms, understanding that things can change from day to day. What's it looking like at this moment?
James, I think this is a re-election cycle, and any re-election, the key question for the Brazilian voters is if Bolsonaro, the current president Jair Bolsonaro, deserves to have another term in office or not. As of today, most of the Brazilians, they reject the current government, the current way that Brazil is being managed, and that makes the re-election very hard for Bolsonaro. And as you know, many presidents in the Americas, they did suffer in the re-election bids. There's the example of Mauricio Macri in Argentina, even Donald Trump in the US. They were not re-elected mostly because their term in office was more disapproved than approved. So right now, this is the biggest issue for the Bolsonaro government. As you know, the Brazilians are suffering in many economic issues. They are having trouble to deal with inflation, with unemployment, with the increase of poverty, and anything related to economics goes to the account of the president. So the success or not of the re-election for Bolsonaro will go through his popularity, and his popularity is very linked to the economic performance of Brazil. And right now, many people are struggling. Having said that, we have regions of Brazil that are better off, especially the regions that are related with the agribusiness. And of course, those regions heavily support Bolsonaro and heavily approve the Bolsonaro government. And just to conclude here, we have in this election, of course, a very known figure as former President Lula. And he comes with a lot of memory, especially from the low-income voters, especially from the Northeast and the North of Brazil, that he's a very popular figure, including he's a much bigger figure compared to his party, the PT. But on the other hand, he also brings the rejection of the PT. The middle class in Brazil still carries a lot of rejection for regarding the PT years, because of the corruption scandals, because of the way especially Dilma handled the economy in his second term. So we have two different questions on the minds of the voters right now. First one is Bolsonaro deserves to be 4 more years in office. And the second one, if the PT and Lula, they deserve to get back, to be back on the presidential palace. And right now, there's more people that disapprove the government than people that actually rejects the PT. So as of today, of course, Lula, I think in my opinion, and this all the polling and data that we have seen, is the front runner.
So I want to come back to that in a minute, but let's go and look at what the press in Brazil has talked about, the third way. The candidates that in the past supported Bolsonaro but have broken with him, such as Sérgio Moro, the prosecutor of the car wash operations, who has been running as a pre-candidate, but has recently indicated that he might put a pause on his campaign, and he's still looking for a political party to support him. We have João Doria, the governor of São Paulo, who just recently resigned in order to run in the elections, because Brazilian election law requires a sitting office holder to resign 6 months before the elections. We have Ciro Gomes, the several times candidate for president, a former minister of Lula's government. They're all polling not very well. In the recent polls, I think Sergio Moro and Ciro Gomes were getting 7 or 8%. That could probably shift as things are changing. Doria has been only getting 2%. And then we have Eduardo Leite, the former governor of the state of Rio Grande do Sul, who came out as a gay man recently and who has very low national recognition, but had challenged Doria in the primaries and now of the party of Brazilian Social Democracy, and now is trying to articulate some kind of slate with the opposition party, the MDB or the PMDB. So where does this third way fit into this whole electoral chess game?
That's a very important question. It's interesting because since I start polling presidential elections in Brazil, I've never had a window of opportunity for, I would say, the third alternative. In 2014, we had a very polarized election, former President Dilma against former senator from Minas Gerais, Aécio Neves. But even at that time, we didn't have a demand on the society, a demand of the voters to an alternative. But we do have in this election cycle. And it's interesting because every time we do, when we are polling this since like for many months, there's half of the country that will be very open to vote for a candidate that would not be Bolsonaro nor Lula. However, this demand is very, I would say, different. So we have people, like you mentioned, that would vote for Ciro Gomes that are more left. And we have people that love Sergio Moro that would never vote for PT, and they are very frustrated with Bolsonaro. They would vote for Sergio Moro. So, but what happened is that we don't have a project or a candidate or a figure that actually concentrates all the people that don't want to have to choose between Lula and Bolsonaro. And it's a very important thing to mention is that one of the most important data that we gather is the spontaneous voting intentions. What is that? When we ask the respondents, the voters, who they would vote for president, but without giving them any options. They just say whatever candidate comes to mind. And on the spontaneous voting intention numbers, Lula has around 30%, that this is the Lula's base. Bolsonaro has 20%, that's his real base, the 20% of spontaneous vote. And the combination of Sergio Moro, Ciro Gomes, and Doria, it's about 10%, 10 percentage points. So what does it mean is that we're having a very strange situation because people don't want to vote to Bolsonaro and Lula, but also the options that are available in the minds of the public opinion right now, they are not, they're not convincing the public opinion to engage with those options. And one of the things that we do have about Ciro, Doria, and Moro, they're well known, as you mentioned, much different from Eduardo Leite, that's not a known figure nationally. But Ciro, Doria, and Moro, they have one thing in common. They are very controversial figures. So they are well known, but also they carry a lot of rejection for different reasons. For each one has his particular history and background. But it's tough because you have three options. Just assuming that Moro is still on. But we have three options, and they are all controversial figures, and that doesn't help the cause. And so that's why Bolsonaro and Lula, they're concentrating all the voting patients as of today.
And because it's a runoff, between the top two candidates, if one of these third way candidates doesn't kind of outbeat Bolsonaro, then it will be in the second round of the elections, Lula and Bolsonaro. So Mauricio, you have a very sophisticated research and survey company that you have been doing really excellent polling. I have a very informal and unprofessional research company, which is called Data Green, where I basically, when I get into a Uber or a taxi in Sao Paulo or Rio, I ask the driver where they're thinking, well, how are they thinking about the elections? I explain I'm an American, and I explain I don't really understand Brazil. They never question why I speak such good Portuguese, but that's okay. And the first thing everyone says is, well, it looks like Lula is ahead. That's something that the polls have been saying consistently. So that's kind of a popular notion. The second thing they say is, but I don't trust the polls. And then I enter into a conversation about why companies such as yours have no interest at all in fabricating false information, because it will destroy your business. No one will hire you to do your work if you're doing something that is not really close to reality. But the question I wanted to ask you is, and this is something I point out to these people, is what is the situation of people who don't clearly identify what they honestly believe to the pollsters, whether they've been asked to do that by some evangelical pastor, which is rumored to occur in some cases, or whether because they don't trust the pollsters? How do you account for that as a professional pollster dealing with those people who might be concealing their real intentions?
That's a very important question. One thing that is not helping at all, as you said, polling, we live by reputation. So we need to do a good job. Otherwise, we don't have a good reputation and nobody will trust our numbers. But one thing that it's a disservice for the cause of providing available data for the public opinion is that we had in the last decade many heads of states and politicians and leaders that, of course, when they don't like a specific result, when they don't like a specific poll, of course, they try to undermine the source of the poll. So this is something we have to handle. As you know, in the United States, also Donald Trump, many times he did emphasize that he didn't trust pollsters and polling. And that translates to a challenge because, especially in the US, not much in Brazil, but some people that don't trust polling at all, don't trust surveys, they sometimes don't want to answer those surveys. And this is a challenge for us because we had this, especially in the case of Brazil, especially people that are core and heavy Bolsonaro supporters. Sometimes you call in a random basis and ask that you were gonna run a survey, and they say, I don't trust surveys, I don't trust polling, so I'm not gonna answer. And of course, we miss that answer, and sometimes, and this is a challenge that we have to tackle. But on the other hand, there's the good thing about what's happening in Brazil right now is that we have a more supply of polling than have never had before in Brazil. We should have like 2 or 3 or 4 maximum polling institutes. Now in Brazil, as you mentioned, in a weekly basis, we have many different polling institutes releasing results, and people are discussing those results. So it's much tougher to say that the polling doesn't work, because then we have a lot of professionals engaging in doing a good work. But saying that, one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that usually those people that don't say they don't trust the polling, they're very engaged with the narrative, with the leadership that, of course, send a message in a very constant way that you should not trust polling, you should not trust press. It's not only polling, there's people also don't trust the media as well. So that's something about the new era of direct communication through the social media, through the apps in the mobile. So anyway, this is a challenge, this is what it is. And we have to work on that and to try to do the best job possible.
So I have a curiosity here. How do you then compensate for this possibility of, or is there any way to be able to adjust for those people who don't trust or who might not be honest in terms of their answer?
Yeah, in terms of honesty, we ask different questions in the survey, in the questionnaire, to try to get consistency. But if someone doesn't want to answer the survey because they don't believe in surveys, of course, we're going to try to find someone with the same profile, and we're going to keep trying and keep doing interviews. But this is a reality. and that's something we need to engage and try to find and keep doing. There's no other way to do it.
And so you have a specific sample for a given survey of a certain number of people with a certain demographic profile in order to reflect the society. How do you do the projections based on that group of people that you've actually gotten answers from? How do you then project that in terms of national results?
Yeah, no, we have the good thing about Brazil that we have a very developed sampling of the Brazilian population, the universe. And that's a two-step sampling process that we always go to the sampling, and it requires that it includes regions, includes gender, includes age, includes level of income, and we try to match that. And it's have been working well. Of course, in Brazil, and this is an important thing to say, we didn't have a census in the last couple of years. Of course, the census is a very important component of sampling. But we have other kind of data gathering from the official sources that we work with. But I'm very confident that, and one good thing about Brazil right now is that in the past it was very hard to reach people only doing cellular phone interviews. But right now in Brazil, even the low-income people in Brazil, they have cellular phones, and it became much easier to locate different groups that were much tougher to do in the past.
So when you do an interview and it's only cellular that the people that you're reaching out to in the surveys you're doing?
I'd say 95% is cell phones.
Yeah. People almost no one has a landline anymore. It's pretty rare, except for in a business, perhaps. It's really unusual for people even in their homes to have a landline.
Yeah, it's becoming very, very, very difficult to find someone that has a landline. So we're saying that the next election cycle, I think we're going to be 100% cell phone.
And so what is the influence of fake news and WhatsApp and Telegram and other social media formats for interfering in election polling or even election results? Can you talk a little about that?
Yes, I myself do a lot of research in fake news and elections. And historically, the one election that really fake news was kind of very important to the final outcome, of course, was the Brexit referendum. As you know, the Brexit campaign has the main message was that the United Kingdom would save 300 million pounds per week, and they would transfer that to the health system. That was a completely fake argument, but 55% of the Brexit voters believed it in that argument. So that was a very critical fake news that had a huge historical implications. In Brazil, in 2018, Bolsonaro won with a very high margin the election, but most of the Bolsonaro voters, and we polled that after the election, around 50% they believed in the history of what some fake news that were spread about the Fernando Haddad, the other PT candidate, especially they were delivering homosexual kids to the schools. This was a very popular fake news that most of the Bolsonaro voters believed it. I don't think they voted in Bolsonaro because of that, but they believed in the fake news. So fake news is huge, especially on most of the people got messages from friends and parents and family, and they do trust. And I did a survey for Folha de São Paulo, a local paper in Brazil, and they 52% trust more family and friends than the traditional media in Brazil. So it's a tough battle. It's not going to be, and the fake news are becoming more and more complicated each election cycle because the technology is there to spread the fake news. And for example, Brazil hasn't had, and I think they are going to face in this election cycle, what we call the deep fake. There is not only the news itself, but it's like a video or an image, what the real people saying something that they have never had said, but it sounds very real, and it's produced by artificial intelligence. So fake news is a big issue, and it's not easy at all, James. And
you're predicting that's going to be a very important part of the campaign this time, do you think?
I think it's going to be, because one thing that I'm projecting is that, as you know, the election itself is going to be very polarized. and most likely we're going to be in August without many window of convincing voters. So basically, the two main campaigns, the Bolsonaro field and the PT field, they're going to basically be hitting each other, basically trying to disseminate bad content about the other camp, and this is the perfect scenario for fake news. That said, I don't think the fake news are going to be something important for the result itself. We have seen this in the US, Biden against Trump. There was a lot of fake news, but because we didn't have many voters to convince, we're basically get out to vote kind of campaign. But so I see a lot of fake news, but I don't see, and maybe I'm being very optimistic on that the fake news are going to be an important component on the outcome of the election.
But if the poll numbers, which are roughly 43% for Lula, 32% for Bolsonaro, could change in the coming weeks, that's a large margin of people who are not on either side. That's 30%, so 25 to 30%, and that's the tipping group, it seems to me. Now, in the United States, it was like 1 or 2%, I think, were the tipping, those undecided voters. But you're arguing that the polarization will consolidate most people as being clearly for, against, and we won't have a situation of the last minute going into the polls and making a decision, which seems to have been the case in the past in Brazil. Maybe I'm wrong about that.
No, one thing that the Brazilian presidential elections, they always present to us is the concentration of voters against the PT. Even the elections that PT won, one candidate always get voters that they are undecided, but they vote against the PT. That happened in 2006, 2010, 2014, and that happened in 2018. Bolsonaro almost won in the first round. I don't know if you do remember. So one thing that I'm expecting is that by the end of the campaign, people are going to concentrate votes in one candidate that potentially can beat Lula. As of today, this candidate potentially will be Bolsonaro, most likely. But this is for sure. Brazilians, that's why, for example, the PT has never won an election in the first round. They always won in the runoff, because there's a lot of people that concentrate vote against the PT, not for a candidate.
But if Lula has a lower rejection rate than Bolsonaro, and Bolsonaro has more than a 50% rejection rate, it seems pretty hard for him to win if his rejection rate is over 50%. How does that work out?
No, it's very hard. It's very hard for Bolsonaro. He has to. First of all, he's gonna get a lot of ground. He's gonna gain a lot of voting intentions. But in order to win, he has to change people's mind. What does it mean? People that right now are disapproving the government, they should be able to approve the government in order to vote for Bolsonaro. So he has to do something about those voters that are rejecting the government. We have like 10 percentage points, 15 percentage points maximum. There are voters that voted for PT in 2014 and voted for Bolsonaro in 2018. Those voters, they don't regret voting Bolsonaro, but they are not happy with the current government. So those are the key voters for Bolsonaro to change minds. And it's tough because those are the people that are more hurt by the economy. So that's a very key challenge. On the other hand, the PT has a significant rejection. We're talking about 45% of the Brazilian voters that don't want to see PT back in power. So it's interesting because Lula exists because of Bolsonaro, and Bolsonaro exists because of Lula.
Right. So what will be the role of the COVID treatment of the pandemic here in Brazil, the way that that Bolsonaro treated it? Is it fading into people's past and it's something that is not currently concerning them, or is it something that could really affect the way people are thinking about how to vote?
No, I think COVID is an interesting thing because in every country that COVID was an issue during the election period, of course, the incumbent and the people in power, they lost. And I can give some examples. The local elections in France, the state elections in India, Donald Trump is a big example of how COVID can impact an election. But right now, the COVID is not an issue for the Brazilians right now. but Bolsonaro lost a lot of his popularity ratings because of COVID. But this is already, I would say, priced in the current approval rates. So unless there is something related to COVID during the campaign, I would say in September and October, I would say this is not going to be an issue for the campaign, because the people that disapprove Bolsonaro because of COVID, they are already voting against Bolsonaro.
And so what about the question of corruption, which of course was very, very important in 18 and diminishing the support for the Workers' Party? It certainly is on the tip of the tongue of many people I talk to when they immediately say, I don't want Lula because he was so corrupt. Is that going to be a factor here in pollers and people's minds, people as they determine who they're going to vote for?
I think in 2018, I think it was the highest point of that narrative of not only anti-corruption, but anti-establishment. We had many people elected for public office with the narrative, I'm different from everything that is there. I'm from outside, I'm an outsider, I am a manager, whatever. Well, this is not going to happen right now in Brazil. And we have seen that in the municipal elections. Municipal elections, that kind of a narrative didn't play well as it did in 2018. So corruption is not the main issue of these elections. I always say that the former minister, Sérgio Moro, would be elected in the first round in 2018. And as you know, he's having a lot of trouble to get in the double digits right now. So, but for the PT, it's going to be a very tough environment, because since 2016, every majority election that PT run, the opponents made about corruption. So it's very tough to go to a campaign that everybody's going to talk about all the corruption of the PT. And that will have a very concrete consequence. All the people anti-PT are going to concentrate votes in one candidate. But as you mentioned, right now is I would say a battle of rejections, and the rejection of the government is higher, is greater compared to the rejection of the PT. But it's tough because the opponents and the narratives are all going to be about corruption. This is a very tough campaign to be.
And how is gender going to play in this election?
I wish I had better news for you, but we are doing actually. I'm polling about women in politics and gender issues on the minds of the voters, and it's not something that we're going to see many changes compared to 2018. The changes that we're going to see are going to be based on the legislation that now forces parties to have a percentage number of women candidates, force parties to allocate resources to women candidates, but this is not an issue in the minds of the voters. And one of the interesting things that I am very concerns me is that even the female voters, they don't actually want to vote for female candidates. It's a very complicated situation. So I don't see many improvements.
Though if in terms of women voters' intentions, it seems that there's a polarization there with many more women against Bolsonaro. Is that correct? Or is that not an accurate result of the poll?
No, it is. We have more women against Bolsonaro, but it's not something significant.
Okay.
And remember, the last election, during the campaign, we also had a lot of important considered number of women against Bolsonaro, but in the end of the day, they voted based on the rejection of the PT, not for Bolsonaro. So that's going to happen again.
So you mentioned earlier in our interview that Bolsonaro or people have been concerned about polling and then election fraud, and the possibility that Bolsonaro has articulated he doesn't trust the results. If he doesn't win the elections, he might not really recognize them. What are you seeing in the numbers about the threat to the actual Institute of Democracy should Lula eke out a victory over Bolsonaro?
Well, James, I think this is what concerns me the most, because we have a lot of signs, bad signs about this election process in Brazil. The first bad sign, as you know, we are going into a very polarized election. So I don't see that we're gonna have too many debates itself. we're going to have basically narrative battles. And this is and what happens, studying what happened in other countries, including the US, is that there is a very likelihood of violence in this election. Of course, we had an episode of violence. What happened with Bolsonaro was a violence, and but this election, the things are much
referring
more...
to when he was stabbed in September of 18 by a deranged person, and therefore didn't participate actually in the debates, because and which, since he's a very bad debater, I think this has actually ended up to his advantage, because he didn't have to go on stage and show how inarticulate he is.
Totally. But Brazilian democracy is not like used to violence in an election campaign, like Mexico, for example. So I see a lot of likelihood of violence. One of the things that we are polling since 2018 is the level of trust in the voting machines in Brazil. And just to give a number, in 2018, before the election, only 10% of Brazilian voters did not trust the voting machine. As of today, almost 4 years later, 30% of the Brazilian voters do not trust the voting machine. And how we don't have any explanation for have a 3 times this number. And another thing that we're doing, and it's not like a sampling statistical fashion, that every year I do interview the military police from 4 states in Brazil, every year since 2017. And we just did it, this interview, we just finished this, and the results are, for me, are very concerning, because 50% of the military police that we did interview do not trust the voting machine.
Wow.
And 40% think that Bolsonaro are going to be something, they don't trust that the judiciary system will treat Bolsonaro fairly in the election. So, and this is something concerns me, because if the military police, that's an institution, an important institution in the Brazilian election process, they are divided. So if you should trust the process or not, this is something new in Brazil. So I'm very concerned. And on top of that, even if Lula is the front runner, but Lula is not going to have like a wide margin against Bolsonaro. We're talking about 5, 6, 4 percentage points. Of course, 5 percentage points produces millions of votes, but we're not talking about a super victory. So the things are going to be, and this is the perfect scenario for Bolsonaro, does not accept the results. And this is something that we have never faced it before after the dictatorship period. So I'm very concerned.
So it did, you're right in terms of an all-out challenge, but I think Aécio Neves did question right after the election of Dilma Rousseff in 2014, but that kind of fell apart. It didn't really get traction.
But Aécio Neves was not the head of state. It's a big difference. Mm-hmm. Aécio Neves, right now we have the president itself, and you know we have seen this as Donald Trump did. We have the president itself, the institution itself, working against the voting process, and you know the voting process in Brazil is much more, I would say, reliable than the voting process in the US. So it's,
absolutely.
So it's tough. We have never faced this. I'm very concerned, because we've seen the Brazilians are going to be facing an election that it's going to be nasty. And then we have a president that said they will not accept the results, and people don't trust the voting machine. So this is a tough combination for me.
So recently, the country marked the 58th anniversary of the military coup of 1964. What are people's attitudes based on polling data towards the legacy or the history or the existence of the dictatorship of 21 years? Is there a rejection of that still, or what's the situation?
Honestly, this is not an issue for the Brazilians. Most of the Brazilians, first of all, they were not born, so they don't recall the period, they don't remember. It's something very distant. This is something that are discussed, I would say, about 5 percentage points of the Brazilian population. Most of the people are not. This is something that they really don't care, actually.
So it's not a nostalgia for the past, but I think what I hear you saying is that there's a possibility of an authoritarian presence mobilizing the military police and perhaps the army to carry out actions to actually challenge the elections and maybe go further than that.
Yeah, no, there's a good thing about that, and there's of course a bad thing. The good thing is that all the discussion and when the president says that the dictatorship was something good for Brazil, actually the public opinion, they don't care. Whatever he says doesn't affect what they think about or not think about the dictatorship. But the bad thing is that they don't have a recollection about how bad it was. And when and we don't know, and when you don't know, higher the risk of re-engaging practices. I'm not saying that dictatorship are going to be back in Brazil, not at all, but the practices, the authoritarian practices, they don't have this recollection. So that's bad.
So what would you advise our listeners, many of whom are learning about Brazil? One of the ideas of Brazil Unfiltered is to expand knowledge about Brazil in the United States. What would you advise them to pay attention to in the next 6 months? What are the things which are going to be particularly helpful in understanding what's going to happen on October 2nd, 2022?
In a more macro level, James, of course, would be the economic performance, because in the presidential presidents, they are accountable about the economy. So this is something Bolsonaro cannot fight against. He's going to be accountable. Whatever happens in the economy, he's the one that's going to be responsible. So the economy plays a very important role in this presidential election. Played in Brazil, played in Argentina, played in Mexico. So this is in a micro level, and this is something very important that we don't talk too much. That as of today in Brazil, as you know, the Congress, they have a lot of power. And I'm talking about budgetary power, political power. Right. And most of the parties in Brazil, when we talk about with the heads of each political party in Brazil, the real election is not the presidential election. The real election is the Congress election, because the money is there, the power is there. So it's very important to understand how the politics we play in Brazil, not only, of course, who's going to be the next president, but how is going to be the next Congress. Because this is a very key. As of today, the Congress has a lot of power to decide where the money goes in the federal budget. And this is a legacy of this government. So, and all the resources, as you know, right now, the Brazil has public funding for the elections, what they call, and all the resources of the political parties, or most part of the resources, are going into the Congress election, not to the presidential election. So it's very important for the Americans to see how the Brazilian Congress are going to look like next year.
Plus all of the additional budgetary allowances given to Congress people in their districts in order to inaugurate a school or a clinic or a hospital to get support. And if Lula doesn't get impeachment protection minority in Congress, he will be vulnerable, I would assume, if he were elected, to the possibility of being impeached, as was Dilma. Although it's interesting, Bolsonaro had a lot of reasons to be impeached and never got anywhere because of the way in which only the president of the Chamber of Deputies, the lower house, can take those impeachment charges to the floor. So he sat on all the requests for impeachments, and so Bolsonaro didn't have to suffer that. And one final question: what is your long-term perspective on the results of 22? What will be the impact of 22 in the future of democracy in Brazil?
Oh, of course, depends. That's a tough question. I hope there's more a wishful thinking than I hope that we learn from this election cycle. And we get lessons learned, because it's going to be tough. It's going to be next. And I hope Brazil and the institutions of Brazil, I hope they manage to navigate that in a peaceful way. And then, because if you navigate this very complicated political environment, well, then we're going to give to the rest of the world a very good sign of maturity of our young democracy. So I hope we face this election cycle with an open mind to learn and we stick with our institutions, we stick with the rules of the game, because otherwise things can get much more complicated, and I don't want that, and I don't hope, and I hope that we in 2023 we see 2022 as part of the democratic process, but as a stronger nation overall.
Mauricio, thank you so much for taking time with us today at Brazil Unfiltered. It's really been a pleasure. I've learned a lot. You're really helping me understand how to read the polls and to follow the news in Brazil. And we're hoping that you'll be able to join us in the second semester of the year to give your up to the date, close to the election analysis of what's going on. Thank you so much for joining us today.
James, thanks so much for the invitation. And above all, congratulations on the work you guys are doing and on the initiative. That's very important for us and for anyone that seeks to understand Brazil better.
Thank you so much. I hope that you enjoyed the interview. Brazil Unfiltered is part of the Democracy Observatory and supported by the Washington Brazil office. If you would like to subscribe to our weekly bulletin on the Brazilian elections, you can do so by writing to www.braziloffice.org. If you missed a recent live broadcast of Dialogues for Democracy, where experts discuss the integrity of the Brazilian electoral process, please check out the video of the event, which is available on this channel. If you are watching on YouTube, don't forget to like the video. And if you have not yet subscribed, please do so. And if you are listening on Apple Podcasts, please leave us a 5-star review to help other people find the program. Until next time, até a próxima.